Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international studies. Produced under the auspices of the International Studies Association and made available through ISA's podcast network. I'm Jamie Free, Associate Provost and Professor of Global Politics at Bridgewater College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with an engaged and innovative teacher of global politics. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by exploring philosophies, strategies, and tactics that make teaching not just effective, but joyful. The more our courses embody the passions that drive our own curiosities, and the more those curiosities are presented as authentically human, the better our chances that our energies and environments will evoke learning. Today's conversation is with Dr. Jessica Auchter, professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Université Laval in Quebec, Canada. Jessica moved to Laval after 10 years of teaching at the University of Tennessee Chattanooga in the United States. She teaches graduate courses on visual culture and politics, the visualization of human rights, and methodologies of visual analysis. She's also a non-native speaker who teaches in French. Our conversation explores modeling for students how to navigate the intersections of really horrible human tragedies and the emotional burdens that thinking about and especially studying those tragedies evoke. A tools-based mindset as perhaps the most lasting learning objective of international relations courses, and the politics of the language of instruction, and how instructors can use those politics to open conversations that connect students to deeper learning. Jessica Auchter, welcome to The Teaching Curve. I can't tell you how excited I am to have this conversation because I know how much you pay attention to your teaching and this interesting context. It's going to be, I'm looking forward to this.
I'm so excited to be able to participate in this conversation.
So, Jessica, you and I have known each other for a while, and not least through the teaching and the pedagogy workshop at International Studies Association Northeast section that's been going for a few years now.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued especially because of the things that you've done recently to adjust not just your career, but your teaching in particular. Tell us a little bit about where you are and who your students are.
Yeah, so currently I'm a full professor at Université Laval in Quebec City, Canada. And I teach at a graduate school of international studies. So right now I only teach master's students, research masters, and professional masters, and PhD students. Before that, I taught at University of Tennessee Chattanooga for 10 years, where I only taught undergraduate students. So the student populations are quite different, not just because of the US-Canada difference, but also obviously because of the status of student. Our students right now in the graduate program I teach in, there's a large number that are from outside of Canada that are international students. So around 50% of our students come from outside of Canada. And it's mostly from Europe, from Francophone Europe, and from Francophone Africa, because it is a French language graduate program. It poses a unique challenge because one thing I've noticed is that a lot of students, especially that come from Francophone Africa, that have certain expectations of what teaching means, and this sort of like traditional sage on the stage model.
Yep.
And that becomes an interesting challenge with how you navigate running your sort of classroom environment when you have an audience of students that have such different and varied expectations. I think when I taught in the US, a lot of students didn't really know what to expect from a classroom environment. But here, I think they because they have more experience, they've done bachelor's degrees already, and now they're coming to a graduate program. They have a model of teaching that they've already experienced, but depending on my students and their background, it's very, very different.
Yeah.
So some of them are more used to this sort of like traditional classroom with the person up front that is the sage on the stage that sort of just dispenses wisdom. And they don't question anything, and there's not a lot of engagement. And then some of them are more used to a model that I tend to run in my classes, which is much more discussion based and collaborative and active participation and that sort of thing. So it poses its own unique challenges too, based on the background that students come to with regards to their expectations of teaching.
So I know from our relationship, and especially, as I said, with the ISA Northeast Pedagogy Workshop, how much you spent thinking and working through pedagogy stuff. How did you decide to devote time and energy to being a good teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I think I obviously, I have a passion for my research and for mentorship and all the other parts of my job. But I think that the reason that I wanted to pursue a PhD and the reason that I wanted to become a professor was because of what the classroom environment does for uh, the way that we engage with questions and like not just content, but questions. I think I've
Mm,
always been in research and teaching a question driven kind of person. And so I was lucky enough to have a variety of experiences throughout my educational background where I had professors that really facilitated that kind of question driven, where they weren't afraid to create an environment where you could ask brave and sometimes stupid questions, and where you could push the boundaries a little bit. It's like
mm.
sometimes the brave questions are kind of like the stupid ones, if that makes sense. And I think
Yeah.
that they weren't afraid to applaud someone for asking those and then find ways to together as a sort of group in a class work through the implications of it and what emerged from those questions that were sometimes really provocative that we maybe wouldn't be able to ask in other forums.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
I think because I had that experience, I just love being in the classroom. I think I would wither up if I couldn't be in a classroom because I just think I learn so much every time I teach, even if I teach the same class repeatedly, because the audience is different, the
Yeah.
discussions are different, I'm different each time I teach it in many ways. And so I think I've always had a passion for teaching because I've always felt that I am at my intellectual best when I'm in an environment where these questions are sort of circulating. And so my goal as a teacher is always to try to create an environment. There's different versions of it. It looks differently in different contexts and different classes at different levels, maybe. But I've always felt I'm at my best teaching if I can create that environment that is kind of question driven, where students can ask themselves their own questions, where we can hash out those questions together. So I think the only reason I am where I am in my career today is because of how I am in the classroom, as how I was as a student and how I am as a teacher.
That's such an exciting thing. Um, I explain it to my students as, look, I know I'm a big geek, but what you just described makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Like that
Yeah.
is so engaging and exciting. How
Yes,
do
this is what I
you,
say or sometimes early in the semester, I say to students, like, I clearly am really excited about this material. At least allow me to have the illusion for like the first few weeks of the semester that you too are excited, just as excited about the material. And then we can all become disillusioned sort of together as the semester goes on. But like, man, you got to keep that excitement.
well, and it's not just, of course, the as the semester goes on, but the material that we study often is heavy. How do
Yeah.
you explain that in a metacognitive way to get the students to recognize that what they can do in this classroom is exactly the what you built it to do, even if they've experienced different kinds of classrooms in the past, or even in that same semester with somebody else who's teaching differently?
Yeah, I think, part of it is related to what you just said, which is the kind of weighted nature of the material that especially I teach, because basically everything I teach on is awful and horrible.
Mm,
I teach on like human rights violations and how we encounter them through visual representations. I teach on gender-based and sexual violence. I teach on atrocity and all of these sorts of awful things, and on humanitarianism, like these humanitarian crises. And so I think when I think about what I want my classes to do, a lot of it is from both a structural and a content based perspective. How can I help guide students through their own encounters with material that is incredibly difficult to
mm,
study from a
mhm,
scholarly perspective because we are also human beings that feel certain things about these types of material. Uh, like when you look at a picture, a news story that contains an image of somebody that has been killed in a war, and it's like a dead body image that is poignant and difficult to see, I don't want to teach my students that this is just a data point for their own research, or that this is something we can just casually discuss in a class, because I don't see it that way myself, even though I do research on those subjects.
Yep.
So I think part of it is thinking about how I can be transparent in my own encounters with the content and structure, and how I, as a teacher, is like myself, who am I as a teacher is not different than who I am as a human being. At the end of the day, I am still me with my emotions and the reasons why I decided to pursue these kinds of avenues of research, and all of my sort of righteous anger about all the horrible things that happen in the world. So I think that motivates me in teaching more than in any other area.
Mm.
And I am also a quintessentially happy person, yet I teach on these awful things, which is kind of a strange disjuncture. But I think a lot of people also have weird reactions to things that are uncomfortable, like laughter if something makes you uncomfortable. So one of the things I do in all my classes is talk about how we respond to the material, and I do check-ins throughout the semester, like how are we
Mm.
doing with this sort of material? And it varies a lot by the individual student, but I think it's really important for them to see that you're not this robot at the front of the classroom that can just talk about atrocity nonstop with no feelings, but also that people need to learn how to engage with this material from like a structural perspective. It's not about learning the content, we can do that
Hmm.
fine. But it's also about like, how do I engage with a world around me that has horrible things happening in it? And why should I? From like a scholarly study sort of perspective. So I spend the beginning of every single class that I teach, like not each individual class, but each semester,
Yeah.
and sometimes scattered throughout the class, talking about why I think it's important to have these conversations, what we might be able to do with the material we study, where we might be able to go with it, and
Hmm.
like what we can expect as a class to come to, because I think a lot of students at every single level, and this has been true from my 18-year-old students that come into my intro classes when I was in Tennessee to the master's and PhD students that I have now.
Yeah.
They come in because they want to change the world and they want to make things better, and they're driven by a lot of idealism. And to some extent, my classes shatter that idealism a bit,
Yep.
which is always rough. But I think that it is partly necessary, but also you can't just shatter that idealism without offering tools to navigate that. So I think a large part of what I do in my classes is offer tools and my own personal experiences of how I've
Hmm.
navigated particular sets of circumstances, and suggestions for how students themselves can navigate their emotional responses to the material that we're covering. So I think for me, like more than just communicating content, navigating students through difficult material is one of my key goals. And I think for people who teach on, American politics, they have their own challenges with how to navigate difficult conversations. I am somewhat happy to not have to navigate those conversations, but I have my own set of difficult sort of conversations to help students navigate their way through. And that's really important to me from the perspective of like one of my teaching goals.
Hmm. I think that's incredible because in some ways now with graduate students in particular, and you said some are masters that are headed towards more professional things, some are kind of more research based, and then you have PhD students. It's not just that you get a chance to model for them as a person who wallows around in really terrible stuff, how to structure that thinking process about it, but you're teaching students in some ways so that they can go off and help other people
Right.
do that, because either in their policy work or in their maybe they go off and teach. The fact that you have expanded in your, or they in your class have expanded the structure of how they're able to think about terrible things, that's a big tool.
Yes,
That,
exactly. I think it's important to give students the tools for how to interact with material after they leave our classes as well. So if you're so focused on communicating specific content, you forget the big picture stuff about how we can navigate this. And even when I was teaching like introductory world politics classes, one of my focuses was how can we encounter the news, like the current events that are going on around us. It's not a current events class, but we do need to understand how to have the tools in this class to engage what's going on around us and connect it to these larger concepts. And you can use that after you leave this class, regardless of whether you become an engineer or somebody that still does work in the arena of international studies. So I think in that sense, maybe I have kind of like a tools-based mindset. Like, what tools can our students use to engage the world around them in different ways, regardless of what they might do afterwards? And for me, because I'm interested in this sort of visual politics dimension, it's all about how you see the world differently than you may have seen it before.
That's interesting. Because not least, you're not just talking about a different kind of audience, but also what you bring into the classroom is different because now you're teaching mostly in French.
I'm teaching mostly in French. Yep.
So talk a little bit about when you say talk about the consistencies that go across, even given that surface level seems very different.
Yeah, so I think from a like approach perspective, I think the students that come to me now have many of the same struggles, interests, all of that as the students I've been teaching the entire time. And it's a matter of having that approach to sort of like manage them through their encounters with these sort of larger questions. The difference is encouragement towards their own research interests, but I did that before too, even in my
Yep.
introductory world politics classes. I pushed them to think about their own engagement with the material. So maybe the depth is a little bit different, but it's the same sort of dynamic. I think the biggest difference from teaching in English to teaching in French is there's maybe two components to it. One is it has made me a lot more reflective on the assumptions that we make in our discipline related to who has access to what forms of knowledge and who is an expert in what forms of knowledge.
Mm.
And I can talk about that a bit more if you'd like. And then the other component is really that the dynamics of how particular ideas do or do not translate into other languages, which sheds a lot of light on, those that are interested in international communication and all of that sort of thing.
Yep.
But I think, especially for me, because in the midst of starting to teach in French, which I started a couple of semesters after I started this new position, I was also at the same time, brushing up on my French and working with a French tutor. And so I would talk to her every week about what I was planning on teaching the following week in my class. And even though I can look up online what a translation for something is, I was not able to look up what the connotation for that word was. So I think if I'm talking about like, for example, I assigned this really excellent article by Emma Hutchinson on the politics of pity related to images of the Asian tsunami. It's an excellent piece, and students really respond quite well to that piece and have historically, as I've assigned it on several occasions. But in this case, I didn't know if the word pity, which is essentially the same word in French, pitié, has the same connotations as it does in English. And then it made me think, well, what connotations does it have in English? Does it have this sort of negative connotations? How do we navigate some of the, like I'll call it like colonialist aspects through which we think about representations of those in need, which is sort of the exact conversation I'm trying to have. But if I say pitié in French, the word pity, pitié, then do my students understand that? Are they immediately participants in that complex conversation about the connotations that go along with it? Or is it something different in French? So having that conversation with my tutor and having to explain to her what the connotations of that word are in English kind of like brings up this whole larger conversation. And then being able to have that same conversation with my students and also explain to my students that you're reading this article in English because many of the readings in our program are in English, the majority, which goes back to my first point about the dominance of the Anglosphere in in the world of expertise. But I think the students are reading the article, but how are they understanding it and grasping it as predominantly native French speakers who do understand English academically, but are conversing in French in the context of my class. So it's this really interesting multiple thing going on. You have
Yeah.
native French speakers who are taking my class mostly. They're reading an article in English. They're then coming to my class, which is in French, with me, a non-native French speaker, and
Yeah.
navigating this sort of complex theoretical dimensions of what it means when we feel pity if we look at an image of someone suffering, and how that impacts and relates to all of these other concepts we're talking about, and what that means for how we think about visual representations of human suffering and how we should learn to look differently and all of these sort of conversations. But it ends up being this really multi-layered uh, idea. And so my approach has been, with regards to the language, to be super transparent with my students about navigating these circumstances, partly because you kind of have to be, because I know I'm not an expert in the French language and I may never be, even as I continue to kind of reach mastery of it. And
Hmm.
I'm able to teach in it, but mastery, it's sort of a subjective idea. But the other reason is that I think having these transparent conversations helps these students that are in a similar kind of circumstance where they're operating in both linguistic worlds academically in many ways,
Yep.
to help them think through how they navigate their encounters with these terms. And there's a lot of other examples of it, but I think the terminology is kind of the best way to illustrate how this dynamic works.
I, I think that's so fascinating because it's not, you said you have all these international students. So it's not just the French language piece of this. It's that culturally they're coming from places where that word might mean different things. In addition to just people's life's experience, where they say, well, I have a emotional reaction to that idea of pity that might be very different, even if they grew up right next to
Yeah.
each other. That is such a complex thing that you have empathy for.
Well, it's been interesting too as we talk about like racial stereotypes, because I have a larger predominance of African students than I've ever taught before. And so it's really interesting as we start to talk about racial dynamics, racial stereotyping in the context of humanitarianism or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and this sort of like stereotypes of the poor, starving African child and what political work that does. It's really interesting to have those conversations with people who are implicated directly in those
Yep.
dynamics. And I think, I've always tried to navigate that in my teaching in terms of like being careful whose voices I elevate and making deliberate choices. And I think people who are concerned with these kinds of issues and are interested in, like decolonizing the syllabus or whatever, those kinds of
Yep.
debates. I think for me, it's more about like whose voices are invited to participate in the conversation, and taking acknowledging that we have the classrooms we have with the student makeup that we have.
Mm.
That is unlikely to change significantly
Mm.
unless you move jobs, and for many
Yeah.
people it won't ever change. But I think how can we attempt to kind of simulate those even when we don't necessarily have those immediate voices in our classroom? And then when we do have those voices, what can we do to try to pluralize the conversation as effectively as we can? But it's been really interesting to see how different individuals from different backgrounds navigate some of these, what I think of as basically power dynamics involved with language and its politics.
Yeah.
So, because there's also, our graduate program requires students to have to test to a certain level in English by the time they finish the program. So it's a French language program, but they have to have English mastery from an academic perspective. So there's also interesting dynamics with regards to that, because the vast majority of academic literature is published in English. And it's interesting for me because, there's obviously a lot of international professors who are working in countries outside of their country of origin, and who
Hmm.
are working in languages that are not their language of origin.
Hmm.
It's widespread in international studies, but there's a lot fewer people going the direction that I went, if that makes sense. Like the vast majority of people are basically being forced to participate in the English dominance of academia. There's a lot fewer people that are like native English speakers that are going to teach in environments where they're
Mm.
teaching in a language other than English. So I kind of am constantly noting the luxury that I have, that my native language is the language of academia, is the language of teaching, even like of articles we assign, of a lot of textbooks on all of that, and a lot of research production. And then for those for whom English is not their native language,
Yeah.
sort of just expected to buy into like their knowledge of English is just expected. And I think about this a lot because in my current job, I get a lot of compliments on like, it's so amazing that you're learning French. And I'm like, yeah, it is, because I'm working really hard. It takes a lot of effort to be able to teach in another language, especially
Yeah.
in a relatively short amount of time, especially a language that, I learned in my youth and used when I traveled, but didn't really ever use in any kind of
Mm.
work or intellectual sense. And it does take a lot of work, but I think for me, that work is appreciated, sort of applauded. But for some people, it's just sort of expected
Yeah.
that the
That's a great
English is
point.
there for,
That's a
which I
really good.
find interesting.
So I really liked what you were saying about the helping the students navigate these power dynamics and the complexity that's built into that. Do you have a tactic? Do you have a something that you use that you could say, this is one thing that seems to consistently work for me on doing that?
Power dynamics exist for every student in sort of every context. So I think I've always tried, at least, to be attentive to how we can attempt to sort of question, dismantle, disrupt those. I think currently the one that I'm more that is more salient is this dynamic of language and that sort of thing. But when I taught in intro classes, one of my big goals was to get students to see that they were implicated in the material that we were studying.
Mhm.
That I think it is like sort of Cindy Weber in her textbook that uses popular culture to study IR, who kind of suggested this idea that sort of like IR is high politics, or positioned in that way, and students are often deemed to be, you can study it, but it will never be accessible to you. And so I think I've always attempted to sort of disrupt that through a variety of tools, including forcing students to take autonomy in their own engagement with the material. So I was always a big fan of these sort of short paper assignments that would force students to engage their own analysis. And even when I taught a 100-person world politics introductory course, I would assign a short paper once a semester where they had to engage the material themselves with their own analysis. Students will often rise to our expectations if our expectations are reasonable and if our expectations, if we are transparent about how those pieces of teaching do something and what they're designed to do. You make choices about what you prioritize. So for me, I would prioritize that because I think it allowed students to see that they had something to say, and it's one mechanism of disrupting those power dynamics.
Hmm.
Now we have conversations in my classes about the language dynamics and about what it means that me, as a non-native French speaker, and Quebec as this sort of francophone environment where there's also a lot of interesting language politics, what does that mean? And how does it relate to some of these other things that we're talking about and these other things that we're studying? And how can we navigate the translation of some of these kinds of concepts and that we're studying in ways that make sense for people who are operating in these kind of complicated bilingual
Mhm.
environments, and what this actually looks like for like what it looks like when it's translated into the policy world, what it looks like when it's translated into like the non-governmental organization. So I think there's different ways to address this issue of these power dynamics at
Yeah.
different levels of courses. So I think it's not just something that can happen in graduate classes. It's something you can do with 18-year-old engineering majors, in ways that kind of get them to see that they themselves have a stake in it.
Yeah.
It shifts their understanding of the power dynamics.
Yeah.
There's realities of the power dynamics that we can't change, but or that require more effort to change by different types of actors. I'll say that. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn to perceive those power dynamics differently
Mhm.
or start to sort of chip away at them in ways that are actually meaningful. And one of my philosophies in teaching has always been think small instead of think big, because I think big change can happen, but it is often not the kind of change that will happen in the course of one semester in my classroom. But
Yeah,
small changes and a series of small changes, those are often the things that have the greatest impact on people's lives, not just how our students change and evolve, but even if we talk about like the practical application of many of these things, if we change the way we see things, that can have a huge impact. If we change our understanding of, aid recipients, then that can actually change the structure of aid in small cases, which has an impact on the lives of particular individuals.
for
So I
sure.
think small. That's my teaching philosophy.
That's awesome. Jessica, you and I are going to get to see each other in Baltimore in a few weeks, and so I'm thankful because I've run out of time for this particular podcast. But you and I are going to get to continue this conversation because I'm enjoying it immensely.
We're the lucky ones to get to
That's
continue.
true.
But anyone listening can hopefully pick us up, either of us up along the margins of this conversation at various places in the months to come.
That's the goal, right? Is to facilitate this conversation, and I think you've done an amazing job of dropping some very evocative ideas into that, so that people can leverage that for their own understanding of what they're doing as they're teaching. So thanks
Yeah.
very much, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, sounds great.
The Teaching Curve podcast is made available in video and audio only versions through the podcast network of the International Studies Association. Audio versions can be found on all major podcast platforms. You can send us feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org and follow us on X @teachingcurve. Thank you all for joining us again on the Teaching Curve. And remember, learn something every time you teach.